The mining colony at the edge of alien-controlled space was a place of dust, metal, and silence. But no silence was as haunting as that of the young alien woman chained to the labor pits. Once she had spoken warnings that the rulers did not want to hear, and for that crime, her tongue had been severed, leaving her unable to speak, only to watch and suffer while others mocked her as a liar. Though no one remembered what lies she had supposedly told, her eyes were wide with unspoken words, but no one cared to look into them, except a human mechanic named Jace, who had been sent to repair the failing machines. That kept the colony alive, and as he worked among the clang of iron and the hiss of steam, he noticed her watching him with a strange intensity, as if begging him to understand something she could not say. The guards ignored her, the other workers spat at her, yet Jace could not shake the feeling that behind her silence lay a story, too dangerous to be told aloud. And one evening, as he adjusted a trembling drill engine, he saw her scrape a mark into the dirt with a shard of stone, her movements urgent and deliberate, though no one else paid attention. And when he leaned closer, pretending to tighten a bolt, he realized her scratches were not random, but shaped into a crude symbol, one he had seen before in old schematics of the colony's unstable power systems, a sign of danger that few understood. Jace felt his heart quicken, for he was a mechanic trained to recognize faults, and the symbol meant collapse or failure, something the rulers would never admit because it would reveal their negligence. Yet this tongueless woman seemed to know it well, and the thought gnawed at him as he lay awake that night in his workshop, hearing the faint hum of the failing reactors deep beneath the colony's surface. He remembered the look in her eyes, desperate and pleading, and he wondered how she had gained such knowledge, whether she had once worked in the heart of the machines, or whether she had discovered something forbidden. But more than that, he wondered why the rulers had been so quick to silence her instead of listening. The next day, when the engines roared back to life, he deliberately passed close to her station, repairing pipes that hissed with hot steam, and again she tried to catch his attention, carving another mark before the guards struck her for slowing her labor. But Jace had already seen enough to confirm she was trying to warn him, not deceive him. And as he looked at her trembling hands and the scars across her lips, he felt a spark of determination that was both dangerous and unstoppable. For in that moment he realized he could no longer ignore her silent cries, and that the truth she carried might be more important than the safety of keeping his head down. And though he did not yet understand what it meant, Jace knew that this silent prisoner was no liar. She was the key to something hidden in the depths of the colony, and he would be the only one willing to listen. Jace returned to the labor camp the next morning with tools strapped across his shoulder. But his mind was far from the gears and pipes he was assigned to fix, for he could not forget the strange scratches the silent prisoner had made, nor the look in her eyes that seemed to demand he see what others chose to ignore. She sat among the rows of weary workers, her hands moving with quiet urgency as she stacked ore into carts. Yet every so often her gaze drifted toward him as though measuring his courage, testing whether he would risk noticing her again. And when one of the drills shrieked with a high-pitched groan and workers stumbled back in panic, she suddenly dropped her tools and began gesturing wildly, pointing not at the surface of the machine, but at a panel near the ground, where few would think to look. And though guards shouted at her for wasting time, Jace crouched beside the engine and, to his shock, found a loose conduit sparking dangerously close to fuel lines, a fault that could have triggered an explosion had it gone unseen. With swift hands he repaired it, sparks flying as the machine steadied back into its rhythm. And when he looked up, the woman's eyes locked with his, filled with both relief and a silent warning that chilled him more than the near disaster. For it told him she had known long before the rest that danger was hidden in plain sight. That night, as the workers were herded back into their quarters, Jace slipped a small piece of coal into her path, pretending it was an accident, and when the guards turned away, she crouched to pick it up and pressed it against the ground, drawing shaky lines that only he could see under the dim light. And though the sketch was rough, he recognized the outline of the colony's central reactor, the same system he had been forbidden to inspect since his arrival. And she marked it with the same symbol she had carved before, a circle broken by jagged cracks, a sign that screamed of failure. His pulse raced as he understood that she was trying to show him something bigger than broken drills. or failing pipes, something at the heart of the colony itself. Yet he knew the cost of even whispering about reactor instability, for such words were considered treason, and treason was punished with exile or worse. Yet how could he ignore the truth when a silent prisoner with no tongue had already risked everything to make it known? Over the following days, Jace continued his repairs, but whenever he found himself near her, she gave small signals: a tap against metal, a scratch in the dust, a gesture toward a vent that drew his attention to places where faults were cleverly hidden, each discovery convincing him further that her knowledge was real and deliberate, not the madness of someone cast aside. And with each passing moment, the weight of secrecy pressed heavier on his shoulders, for he realized she was trusting him alone to see what others would not. And though fear clawed at him, curiosity and a growing sense of duty pushed harder, until Jace understood that he could no longer dismiss her warnings as the desperate acts of a broken soul, but instead had to face the chilling question of why she alone had seen the danger, and why those in power had cut out her tongue rather than listen to the truth she had tried to speak. Jace could no longer dismiss the prisoner's silent warnings, for every day she revealed more pieces of a puzzle that only grew darker the more he studied it. And one night, while the colony slept beneath the dull hum of generators, he lingered in his workshop with the fragments of her drawings spread across his workbench, scraps of coal sketches and marks etched into bent metal sheets he had secretly kept. And as he pieced them together, the image became clear: a crude but unmistakable map of the colony's underground systems, with the central power core drawn at its heart, surrounded by cracks and jagged lines that seemed to bleed outward like veins of fire. And the thought that she, a prisoner with no voice, could know such secrets unsettled him deeply, for even engineers like himself were kept from the deepest levels, unless ordered by the alien overseers. The next morning he caught her watching him again, her eyes darting nervously toward the guards before meeting his, and in that moment he realized she feared not for herself, but for what might come if her warnings were ignored. And so when the shift ended and the guards grew lazy in their rounds, Jace slipped a small piece of broken metal into her hand and guided her to the shadows, behind a half-dead machine, where she knelt quickly and scratched symbols into the dirt, her hand shaking but steady enough to finish what she had started. And when Jace knelt beside her, he understood that she was not merely warning of cracks or malfunctions, but of something far more dangerous. The core was unstable, not in years but in weeks, and when it failed, the explosion would not simply destroy the colony, but tear it from the rock it clung to, turning thousands of lives into nothing but ash. His breath caught in his chest as he looked at her trembling hands, the scars across her lips, the way her eyes pleaded with him to believe. And though his mind screamed that he should bury this knowledge and walk away, his heart told him he had already chosen his path the moment he listened to her. Later, as he walked the metal corridors, he saw patrols moving with unusual discipline, their eyes sharp as they searched the camp, and he realized the guards had noticed his attention toward her, and that any misstep would expose them both. Yet the more they tried to silence her, the more certain he became that she had spoken the truth long ago and was punished for it. That night, unable to resist, Jace slipped into the archives of the repair station under the guise of fetching spare parts, and there he found old schematics buried beneath layers of restricted stamps. And as he unrolled the brittle sheets, his heart sank, for the fractures drawn on the official blueprints matched the crude cracks the woman had drawn in coal dust, confirming that her warnings were not the madness of a broken prisoner, but knowledge stolen from places she should never have seen. Clutching the papers to his chest, Jace felt the walls closing in, for now he carried proof of a truth so dangerous that it had cost her tongue. And he knew the question was no longer whether she was right, but whether they would survive long enough to reveal it. The discovery weighed heavily on Jace, for every line of the hidden blueprints echoed the prisoner's warnings. Yet the moment he tucked the fragile sheets beneath his clothes, he felt the colony itself turn hostile, as though unseen eyes were already upon him. And when he returned to the camp the next day, the guards were no longer careless but sharp and watchful, whispering into their comms whenever he drew near the silent woman, their suspicion tightening like a noose. And Jace knew that if they caught even a glimpse of the drawings he carried, both he and the prisoner would vanish into the tunnels and never return. That evening, while repairing a conveyor engine, he saw two patrols moving in formation, scanning every corner with rifles ready. And though the workers pretended not to notice, Jace felt his stomach twist with dread because he knew they were not searching for contraband or missing tools, they were searching for him. And when his eyes met the prisoners across the dust-filled chamber, her gaze widened in alarm, and she began gesturing urgently toward the old access shafts that led below the camp. Shafts long abandoned and considered unsafe. Yet she moved with such conviction that Jace knew it was their only chance. As night fell and the camp settled into uneasy silence, he slipped a wrench into his belt and timed his steps with the heavy boots of the guards, using shadows as his shield until he reached her side. And without a word they darted into the broken shaft, the metal rungs groaning as they descended into a darkness that swallowed light itself, their breaths echoing against stone walls lined with rusting pipes, and above them shouts erupted, boots pounding against the ground as the guards realized their prey had slipped away. Deeper and deeper they went, the tunnels twisting into forgotten passages where steam hissed from cracked valves, and pools of black water reflected their flickering lamp. And Jace clutched the fragile schematics as though they were his own lifeline, for without them, no one would believe what they had risked so much to uncover. Behind them, the echoes of pursuit grew sharper, the sound of metal striking stone, voices barking orders, beams of light flashing through the darkness, and Jace quickened his pace, pulling the prisoner along until they stumbled into a cavernous chamber, filled with ancient machinery that hummed weakly as if waking from a long sleep. And there she dropped to her knees, using the grime at her feet to trace more marks with her trembling fingers, revealing that this place connected directly to the reactor's arteries. A hidden way to prove the danger, but before Jace could study it fully, a blast of light scorched the tunnel wall behind them. The guards had found the entrance, and their shouts grew louder with every heartbeat, forcing Jace to realize that their time was running out, and that from this moment on, survival would mean more than repair skills. It would demand choices that could shake the entire colony. The tunnels shuddered as if the colony itself were alive and groaning under the weight of its secrets. And Jace knew every step forward carried him deeper into danger, for behind them the voices of the guards echoed like hounds on a trail. But ahead lay the failing heart of the reactor that the silent woman had tried to warn them about. And as he dragged her through the twisting shafts, their flickering lamp revealed pipes weeping steam and walls vibrating with hidden pressure, a sure sign that the system was close to breaking. And when they stumbled into a chamber where a collapsed support beam had torn through conduits, sparks rained down in showers of blue fire, forcing them to shield their faces. Jace dropped to his knees and studied the tangled mess with the trained eyes of a mechanic, quickly realizing that the core was bleeding power into places it was never meant to flow. A slow death that would soon turn into a violent one. The prisoner knelt beside him, her hands sweeping through the dust as she drew frantic lines that circled the core, at the center of her crude map, then slashed across it with jagged strokes. And Jace understood her meaning. Without words, the explosion was no longer weeks away but mere days, perhaps hours if pressure continued to rise, and his throat went dry as he imagined the entire colony ripped apart, while those above continued to pretend nothing was wrong, silencing anyone who dared to tell the truth. The sound of boots clanging against ladders drew nearer, a reminder that they had little time, and Jace, with sweat streaking his face, began pulling at bolts and rerouting what he could with bare hands, and a wrench that trembled in his grip, trying to slow the collapse long enough to find proof. But the machines here were older than anything he had worked on, their parts fused together by years of neglect, and every attempt to seal the cracks felt like placing fragile cloth over a roaring fire. The prisoner tugged at his sleeve, pointing to an access panel glowing faintly in the shadows, and when he forced it open, he found a diagnostic console still alive, its screen filled with warnings in alien script, red symbols flashing in desperate repetition. And though he could not read all of it, the meaning was clear: overload imminent. Evacuation required, catastrophe certain. Clutching the schematics and now the console's data, Jace felt both triumph and despair, for he finally had undeniable proof of her truth. Yet there was no guarantee they could escape the tunnels before the guards closed in. And as the first beam of a searchlight swept across the chamber and voices shouted orders, Jace grabbed the prisoner's hand and pulled her toward another passage, the weight of the knowledge burning in his mind. Because now he understood that survival alone was not enough. They had to bring this truth to light, before the colony became a tomb of metal and ash, and the silent woman's sacrifice would have been for nothing. The chase through the tunnels ended when Jace and the silent woman burst into the reactor's central chamber, a cavern of steel and light where the air trembled with the hum of unstable power. And before them stood the massive core, its surface cracked with glowing veins that pulsed like a dying heart, each throb shaking the ground beneath their feet. And Jace knew that if nothing was done, the colony would be destroyed. Yet the guards were already pouring in from the passageways, their weapons raised, shouting for him to surrender. And in that moment he realized he could not fight them with strength or numbers, but only with the truth. So he sprinted to the nearest console and slammed the schematics against its reader, forcing the ancient system to display raw data across every connected screen in the colony. And instantly alarms lit up in red, warnings streaming across the monitors in symbols even the lowest worker understood: overload, meltdown, destruction. And as the colony workers watching their terminals saw the same flashing signs, a roar of panic spread through the stations above. No longer whispers, but undeniable proof. And the guards hesitated, their orders cracking under the weight of truth too bright to hide. The silent woman staggered to Jace's side, her face pale in the glow of the reactor, her hands raised high as she dragged her fingers across her scarred lips, and then pointed to the failing core, a gesture so raw and powerful that no voice was needed. And in that moment the story of her so-called lies unraveled before everyone's eyes. For the traitor was not the woman, but the rulers who had silenced her. And Jace felt the ground shake as workers in the colony began to resist, seizing tools and pushing back against the guards who had forced them into silence for years. And chaos erupted, but it was not chaos born of fear. It was the birth of revolt. And in the center of it all stood the tongueless woman whose truth now thundered louder than any speech. Jace pulled at levers and locked the system into emergency containment, buying precious hours before the core would collapse completely. And as sparks rained down from ruptured pipes, and the guards retreated under the pressure of the uprising, he turned to her and saw not a prisoner but a survivor, a woman who had carried the burden of truth when no one else dared. And though she could never speak again, her silence had shaken an empire built on lies. And Jace, the human mechanic who had chosen to listen, knew that together they had given her voice back to the world, not through words but through proof, courage, and a warning that could never again be silenced. And as the workers surged around them, rallying with a fire that could not be extinguished, Jace realized that this was not the end of their struggle but the beginning. For the colony might still fall, but its people had finally learned that truth, once revealed, could never be chained again.